President Zelensky's relentless wall-to-wall Western media campaign has successfully rallied much of the global north around Ukraine and against Russia. In the weeks since the invasion's start, that's been the case, but as resounding as Zelensky's pleas for aid and appeals to law and justice have been in the West, his message has been received considerably less well by those in the global South. That's according to a new piece by Dr. Trita Parsi. He writes, quote, Western demands that the global South make costly sacrifices by cutting off economic ties with Russia to uphold a rules-based order have begotten an allergic reaction. That order hasn't been rules-based. Instead, it has allowed the U.S. to violate international law with impunity. The West's messaging on Ukraine has taken its tone deafness to a whole new level, and it is unlikely to win over the support of countries that have often experienced the worst sides of the international order.
Dr. Trita Parsi is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a professor at Georgetown University. He joins us now to discuss. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So could you walk us through this a little bit more, elaborate on the piece you wrote? How is it that what has been irresponsible about U.S. behavior that has helped foster this kind of distrust that you described?
Well, so as I write in the piece, Zelensky has been extremely effective in rallying Western support, and Western support has been tremendously fast and strong compared to what anyone had expected before this crisis. But it is quite remarkable how little it has resonated with folks outside of the West, particularly the global South. And it's to a very large extent because of this threat. Now, obviously, these countries have their own dependencies on Russia's or vulnerabilities to Russia. And as a result, they have a degree of hesitancy. And that's been what most of the media focus has been on. But I think there's a deeper reason for this as well, which is when we are saying that this war is about the future of the rules-based order, that's where we're losing most of the global South. Because the rules-based order for most of the world has been the United States being able to do whatever it wants outside of international law, whether it is to invade Iraq, whether it is to invade Libya, or a whole set of different ways in which the United States actually has eroded the rules-based order itself, such as, for instance, sanctioning the judges of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which we now want to take Putin to and try him for war crimes. So it creates a situation in which essentially we're asking some of these states to make pretty severe sacrifices in order for them to help uphold a rules-based order that gave the United States the ability to act outside of that order. Essentially, we're asking them to make sacrifices for American exceptionalism. And that's precisely why this message is not resonating with them. And I want to emphasize, it's not that they're sympathetic necessarily to Russia or that that they're sympathetic to Russia or that they're not sympathetic to the Ukrainians. I think by and large, they do view this as a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. There may be various reasons for it in which they perhaps do put greater weight onto the expansion of NATO than what many folks in the West would do. But overall, their view is that Russia is the aggressor. But they're not going to make these sacrifices in order for the United States to be able to continue to act under the rubric of American exceptionalism.
Can you give us more of an idea, put a finer point on the kinds of commentary that are coming out of the global South in this moment?
Well, it's quite fascinating to see what they say. I think it was quite interesting, a piece in The Guardian that quoted a gentleman who played a very important role in both in Amnesty International, but also for a major African organization, saying, for decades, the West has been ravaging and colonizing Africa, stealing its resources, etc. And then you had the Cold War, in which a lot of the wars between the United States and the Soviet Union were taking place in third countries, including in Africa. And now we're asked to allow that to happen again. And the comment was that just please don't bring your war to our shores. I thought it was quite fascinating that is the perspective. They see this as a European conflict about the European order, not about the global order. And as a result, they don't want to have any part of it.
Yeah, Trita, how deep does this resentment run? It sounds like that's what you're talking about, that the rest of the world outside of the West is kind of looking at the West and saying, well, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. I mean, look at the United States, invading Iraq and now turning around and saying, oh my gosh, how horrible it is for this other country to do an invasion. Plus, like you mentioned, all the regime change efforts, color revolutions, coups, sanctions, you name it. The United States has been very aggressive towards much of the world. I think right now, how many countries do we have sanctioned? It's like 1 out of every, so many countries. It's like a really high number that is experiencing U.S. sanctions right now. So how deep does this actually run? Has it gotten to a point of feeling of hostility, or is it still at the stage of, okay, you guys are hypocrites, we're not going to engage? Is it at the point where it's a step further and it's, okay, you guys are, we're feeling resentful, or is it now we're feeling hostile? Where are they at on this?
I've not picked up any particular hostility, and I think you're quite right. The hypocrisy is there. It's annoying. It's always been there, so it's not necessarily something new. What's new is that we're asking them to make sacrifices in order for us to continue to be hypocritical. That's where it's creating a problem. Because that's essentially what it is. We're not saying anything about that the future international order will be a much better one than it was before. That's not what we're saying. We're essentially saying that the old order was fantastic, and now we're asking the global south to make sacrifices to uphold it, and they are not buying it. I also want to emphasize, a lot of these states are close allies of the United States, and they want to have a good relationship with the United States. They're not taking a side against the U.S. in that sense, but they are worried because with the U.S.'s tremendous power, which it has not used particularly responsibly, it has created a situation in which these countries, without hostility against the United States, nevertheless feel that they need to have some form of a counterbalance against the United States if they end up being on the wrong side of American adventurism and unilateralism. So as a result, by and large, they tend to view that a more multipolar world is a positive, not because they don't want to have any enmity with the United States, but because they want to have an option of being able to have a counterweight against the United States if they feel that that is necessary. This is also, incidentally, very true for some very close allies of the United States, who the United States, frankly, is protecting. But when they saw the swiftness in which the United States cut off Russia from the international financial system, they were, on the one hand, impressed, but on the other hand, very worried. If that is a power the United States has at its disposal, mindful of the fact that we have not been particularly responsible for the last 2 or 3 decades, we shouldn't be surprised that even friends are worried about how we will use that power.
Yeah.
Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Stick around for more Rising in just a minute.